The engine was still running when he realized he had already missed the call. 3 notifications blinked on his phone at once: the hospital, the power company, and his daughter's school. He gripped the steering wheel, staring through the windshield as rain streaked down the glass, knowing that answering any one of them would force a choice he wasn't ready to make. This was not a crisis moment that came with shouting or sirens. It was quieter than that, heavier and far more dangerous. Because tonight, one wrong decision could unravel everything he had been holding together for years. He was a single father, and his life no longer moved in months or even weeks, but in hours. Every day was an exercise in calculation. How long the food would last, how stable his job remained, how much strain his child's body could handle before the next appointment. There was no margin for error, no room for impulse, and no safety net waiting beneath him. What made this night different was the opportunity sitting on the passenger seat beside him, an unexpected chance that promised temporary relief but carried permanent consequences if mishandled. It was not charity, and it was not a gift. It was access, conditional and fragile, offered by a system that did not know him and was not designed for someone like him. He understood immediately what was at stake. Accepting help often came with assumptions, and assumptions had a way of stripping people of dignity. If he used this opportunity recklessly, it would confirm every quiet suspicion already stacked against him. If he used it too cautiously, it might disappear before it could change anything at all. There would be no applause for getting it right and no forgiveness for getting it wrong. For years, he had learned to survive without being seen, to make impossible decisions without witnesses. But now, unseen eyes would measure every move he made, not caring why he chose as he did, only whether he fit their definition of responsible. What they did not understand, what they had never needed to understand, was that survival is not about spending or saving. It is about choosing which losses you can live with. He did not answer the phone right away. Instead, he turned the engine off and sat in the sudden silence, letting it settle around him like a heavy blanket. The rain continued tapping softly against the roof of the car, a sound so ordinary it almost felt mocking. Somewhere inside the hospital building behind him, a nurse would be logging missed calls. Somewhere across town, an automated system would be preparing another notice about overdue balances. And somewhere else, his daughter's teacher would be wondering whether he had seen the message yet. This was how life worked now. Everything happening at once. All of it urgent. None of it waiting. He checked the time on the dashboard clock. 8:47 p.m. Too late to fix anything tonight. Too early to pretend it would all resolve itself by morning. He picked up his phone, scrolled past the notifications, and placed it face down on the seat beside him, next to the envelope that had changed the shape of his evening. He did not open it again. He already knew what was inside. People often imagined poverty as chaos. They pictured noise, drama, bad decisions made loudly and often. What they rarely understood was that survival required discipline, an exhausting, invisible discipline that left no room for spontaneity. His life was not disorganized. It was painfully organized. Every dollar, every hour, every ounce of energy was accounted for long before it was spent. He drove home slowly, taking side streets out of habit. Gas was cheaper this way. The difference small but cumulative. He parked in his usual spot, 3 blocks from the building, because it was free and because the walk helped him think. By the time he reached the apartment, the rain had slowed to a mist, clinging to his jacket as he climbed the narrow stairs. Inside, the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. The lights were still on, for now. He hung his jacket on the back of a chair and moved toward the bedroom, pausing at the doorway to watch his daughter sleep. She lay on her side, one arm wrapped around a pillow, her breathing shallow but steady. At 9 years old, she had learned to sleep carefully, the way other children learn to ride bikes or tie their shoes. He stood there longer than necessary, as if memorizing the moment. In the kitchen, the table held its usual arrangement: a half-used notebook, a pen, a stack of envelopes organized by size rather than importance. He had learned that opening them all at once only made things worse. Instead, he opened one per day, sometimes two if he felt strong enough. Tonight, he opened none. He made tea, not because he wanted it, but because it gave his hands something to do. The notebook contained columns of numbers written in careful handwriting. Rent, utilities, medication, transportation, food. Each category had notes beside it, dates, partial payments, promises made and broken. He did not track dreams in this notebook. Dreams were inefficient. He tracked obligations. Tomorrow's list was already written. Wake up at 5:30. Drop her off at school by 7:45. Work until 3:00. Call the hospital billing office at lunch. Pick up prescription before closing. He stared at the list and added one more line at the bottom, hesitating before he wrote it. Consider the offer. He closed the notebook. The offer had not come with ceremony. There was no dramatic conversation, no emotional appeal. It had arrived through a channel designed to sound neutral, procedural, almost forgettable, a pilot program, temporary access, a chance to stabilize accounts while long-term evaluations were conducted. The language had been careful, polished, and distant. It promised nothing permanent and guaranteed nothing emotional. What it offered was time. Time was dangerous. Time made people careless. Time made people believe things could improve without constant vigilance. He had survived this long by assuming the opposite, that everything could fall apart at any moment if he relaxed his grip. He washed his mug and dried it immediately, the way he always did. Water left standing led to mold. Mold led to repairs. Repairs led to costs he could not absorb. This was how his mind worked now. Every action connected to a chain of consequences, stretching far beyond the present moment. When his wife was alive, they used to argue about this. She believed in buffers, in breathing room. He believed in preparation. After she died, preparation was all he had left. He sat at the table and opened the envelope again just long enough to confirm that it was still real. The instructions were clear. The limits were outlined. The monitoring was explicit. This was not trust. It was permission under observation. He folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope. If he accepted, someone would be watching. If he declined, nothing would change. That was the trap. People often asked him why he did not take risks, why he did not try something different. They spoke as if risk were an abstract concept, a personality trait rather than a calculation. Risk was easy when failure meant disappointment. It was harder when failure meant losing heat in winter or medication or a home. He thought of the grocery store checkout line where his daughter always lingered near the small rack of toys. He thought of the way she pretended not to look, as if wanting something counted as asking. He thought of the purple notebook she carried to school, its corners worn soft from use. He thought of how carefully she followed the doctor's instructions, how she monitored herself so he would not have to worry more than he already did. Every decision he made had her weight inside it. He turned on the small lamp by the couch and sat down, letting the light pool around him. Outside, a neighbor's television flickered through the window, laughter leaking into the hallway. Ordinary lives continued, untouched by the calculations consuming him. He picked up his phone again and turned it face up. The notifications were still there. He dismissed them one by one, not ready to respond, but not ready to ignore them either. Avoidance was a luxury. Delay was sometimes a strategy. When he finally lay down, sleep did not come easily. His mind moved through scenarios, adjusting numbers, testing outcomes. If he used the access for this bill first, then that one waited. If he split the amount, neither problem disappeared. If he saved part of it, would that be seen as restraint or misuse? There was no correct answer, only defensible ones. This was what survival demanded, not morality, Not gratitude, not performance, but constant justification. Every choice had to be one he could explain calmly, rationally, without anger, because anger made people suspicious, and suspicion closed doors faster than debt ever could. As he drifted toward sleep, one thought surfaced again and again, heavy and unresolved. He was not afraid of making the wrong choice. He was afraid of being judged for making the right one. The email arrived the next morning exactly at 9:02 a.m., as if precision itself were part of the message. No greeting, no acknowledgement of who he was beyond a reference number and a case ID. Just a subject line that read, Program Access Confirmation. He did not open it right away. He read the subject line twice, then locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. As he stood in the school parking lot watching his daughter disappear through the front doors, she did not look back. She never did. She had learned early that goodbyes worked best when they were quick and uncomplicated. Only after he was back in the car did he open the message. The language was careful, scrubbed of emotion. It explained that he had been selected temporarily to participate in a resource allocation trial designed to evaluate how families under financial strain utilize short-term relief. The phrasing was almost elegant in its distance. There was no implication of kindness, no hint of concern. It was an experiment, and he was one of its variables. He read the message slowly, line by line. Access would be limited, spending categories would be monitored, transactions would be reviewed for appropriateness. Continuation depended on compliance. At the bottom, a single sentence stood apart from the rest, bolded but still impersonal. Misuse may result in immediate termination of access. He exhaled long and controlled. This was not help, this was observation. He had encountered this tone before, at hospital billing offices, during appeals and conversations where people pretended neutrality was the same as fairness. The system never said it distrusted him. It simply behaved as if it did. At work, he moved through the day on autopilot. His hands performed tasks his mind barely registered. He nodded at the right moments, answered questions with short, efficient responses. No one there knew about the email, about the numbers now hovering in the background of his thoughts. That invisibility had always been his advantage. Attention, he had learned, was dangerous. At lunch, he sat alone in his car and read the message again, this time opening the attached documents. Pages of conditions unfolded across the screen. Approved uses, restricted uses, gray areas labeled subject to review. Medical expenses were permitted, housing stabilization was permitted, utilities were permitted. Nothing else was explicitly forbidden. Nothing else was clearly allowed. That was intentional. Ambiguity created leverage. Ambiguity made people cautious. It ensured compliance not through trust, but through fear of misinterpretation. He understood the design immediately. The system did not need to control his choices directly. It only needed to make him doubt them. He closed the documents and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. He had spent years being careful with money because he had no choice. Now he was being asked to be careful because someone was watching. That difference mattered. On the drive home, he passed the pharmacy, where he usually picked up his daughter's medication. He did not stop. He passed the grocery store. He did not stop there either. Every instinct told him to pause, to wait, to plan. Acting too quickly could look impulsive. Acting too slowly could look ungrateful. He hated that he was already thinking in those terms. At home, the apartment looked the same as it always did, but he noticed it differently now. The flickering kitchen light, the crack in the bathroom tile, the thinness of the walls that carried other people's lives into his own. Each flaw translated into a potential transaction, a possible justification. He sat at the table with the laptop open, the documents displayed, and began making a new list. Not a budget, a rationale. If questioned, why this expense first? If challenged, why this amount? If accused, how would he explain restraint without appearing wasteful? This was the work no one acknowledged, the mental labor of proving responsibility before it was ever doubted. His daughter emerged from her room in the late afternoon, backpack slung over one shoulder. She moved slowly, conserving energy, her body already accustomed to limits she should not have had to understand. "How was school?" he asked. She shrugged. "Fine." He watched her carefully, the faint discoloration beneath her eyes, the way she leaned against the counter as she took off her shoes. Fine meant manageable. Fine meant she was protecting him from worry. "What's for dinner?" she asked. He hesitated. The refrigerator was half full. "Enough for tonight, enough for tomorrow, not enough for comfort." "Pasta?" he said. "And vegetables." She nodded, satisfied, and disappeared back into her room. He stared at the closed door for a moment longer than necessary. That evening, he made his first decision. He logged into the system using the credentials provided. The interface was clean, almost elegant. It displayed available balance, recent activity, empty for now, and a reminder that all actions were subject to review. A digital version of someone standing behind him, arms crossed, saying nothing. He entered the hospital's billing portal and began the process of making a payment. He did not pay the full amount. That choice came easily, instinctively. Paying everything at once looked dramatic. Dramatic invited scrutiny. It suggested desperation or recklessness. Instead, he calculated the minimum necessary to prevent escalation, to keep accounts current without drawing attention. He submitted the payment and logged out. Nothing happened. No confirmation email, no acknowledgement. Just a silent update to the balance. He sat back in his chair, heart beating faster than it should have for something so simple. This was the danger of conditional access. It turned ordinary actions into tests. Over the next 2 days, he moved deliberately. He paid the electric bill down to just below the cutoff threshold. He paid part of the rent, enough to stop the eviction process, but not enough to raise questions. He refilled the prescription, choosing the generic option without hesitation. Each transaction was measured, each one chosen not just for its necessity, but for how it would appear. At the grocery store, he walked the aisles with unusual care. He skipped items he normally would have bought, small comforts, nothing extravagant. He imagined someone reviewing the receipt, highlighting lines, making notes. Produce was safe, staples were safe, anything else required justification. At the checkout, his daughter stood beside him, her eyes drifting toward the small display near the register. He saw it immediately, a new coloring book, bright and unopened, its cover unbent. She did not reach for it. She did not ask. She simply looked. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He knew the amount. He knew it would not matter financially. He also knew it would matter in every other way. A purchase like that was harmless in real terms, but dangerous in symbolic ones. Someone could label it unnecessary. Someone could question his priorities. He placed the item back on the shelf. His daughter did not react. She never did. That, somehow, made it worse. Back in the car, she buckled herself in carefully, then rested her head against the seat. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked quietly. "No," he said immediately. "Of course not." "Okay." The conversation ended there, but the weight of it followed him home. That night, he received his first message from the program. It was short, polite, neutral. "We've noticed activity on your account. Please be advised that all expenditures are under review to ensure alignment with program goals." No accusation, no praise, just a reminder. He closed his laptop and leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. This was the cost of access. Not money, but constant self-surveillance. The feeling of being measured against a standard that had nothing to do with lived reality. He understood now why so many people rejected opportunities like this, why pride sometimes outweighed practicality. It was not arrogance. It was exhaustion. Still, He did not regret accepting, because despite the scrutiny, despite the careful performance required, something had shifted. For the first time in years, the ground beneath him felt marginally more stable. Not safe, not secure, but less immediately threatening. He could breathe, just enough. And that, he knew, was exactly what the system intended to control. What the system recorded were numbers. What it could not record were pauses. Each morning before his daughter woke up, he sat at the kitchen table with his phone face down beside his coffee. He did not check messages immediately. He learned early that reacting too fast created mistakes, and mistakes attracted attention. Instead, he looked around the apartment, letting his eyes rest on the ordinary details that defined his life. The chipped edge of the counter, the calendar taped to the wall, the small pile of coins in a glass jar that he never touched unless absolutely necessary. This was where the real work happened, before any transaction, before any explanation. The program tracked outcomes, not process. It saw the bill paid, not the hesitation before clicking confirm. It saw the grocery total, not the internal debate that preceded each item placed in the cart. It had no column for restraint, no metric for sacrifice. That was fine. He was not doing this to be understood. On the fourth day, he faced a choice that did not fit neatly into any category. The school nurse called mid-morning. His daughter had complained of dizziness during recess, nothing dramatic, nothing alarming enough to trigger protocol, but enough to warrant attention. He listened carefully, asking questions, calculating in real time. Picking her up early would mean missing the second half of his shift. Missing the shift meant lost wages. Lost wages meant pressure elsewhere. He told the nurse he would be there within the hour. At work, his supervisor nodded without comment when he explained. There was no sympathy in the gesture, but there was no resistance either. He had learned to be reliable enough that flexibility, when it came, did not feel like a favor. In the car, with his daughter buckled into the seat beside him, he felt the familiar tightness return. She stared out the window, quiet, conserving energy. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "For what?" he asked. "For making you leave work." He said her name gently, firmly, the way he always did when correcting her. "You didn't make me do anything." She nodded, but he knew she did not fully believe him. At home, he settled her on the couch with a blanket and a glass of water. He checked her pulse, her breathing, the color of her lips. Everything seemed stable. The dizziness passed within the hour, but the incident lingered in his mind. He opened the program portal again, not to spend, but to look. Medical transport was covered. Emergency visits were covered. Preventive appointments were covered. Lost wages were not. He closed the browser. That evening, he adjusted his calculations. He would need to compensate for the missed hours. He skipped an item on the grocery list he had planned for later in the week. It was not essential. It would wait. This was how balance was maintained, not through abundance, but through constant redistribution of absence. Over time, the program became a quiet presence in his life, like a shadow that followed him from room to room. He did not think about it all of the time, but he was always aware of it. The knowledge that someone else could interpret his choices differently altered the shape of those choices, even when he resented the influence. He found himself avoiding extremes. No large payments, no conspicuous restraint, everything in the middle, everything defensible. At the pharmacy, he asked questions about dosage alternatives, about splitting refills, about timing, not because he doubted the medicine, but because he needed to ensure continuity. A single lapse could undo months of careful management. The pharmacist recognized him now, greeted him by name. Familiarity, he had learned, was a form of security. When people knew you, they were less likely to assume the worst. At night, After his daughter fell asleep, he reviewed the day's decisions in his head, not with regret, but with assessment. What could have been done differently? What risk had he underestimated? What assumption might someone else make? This internal review never appeared in any report. The hardest choices were the ones that looked insignificant. One afternoon, he found a note in his daughter's backpack, a permission slip for a field trip scheduled 2 weeks out. The cost was modest, almost insulting in its simplicity. He stared at the amount for a long time, the paper soft between his fingers. The program guidelines did not mention school activities. He imagined the receipt, the line item: educational expense, child enrichment, non-essential. He imagined explaining it to someone who had never watched a child learn to exclude herself before being excluded by others. He folded the paper and placed it back in the backpack. That night, he told her he would see what he could do. She smiled, hopeful but careful. He did not sleep well. In the morning, he paid the fee using his own account, not the program's. The money came from the jar of coins, supplemented by a small transfer that left him less comfortable, but more at peace. The system would never know. This pattern repeated itself in small ways. When a choice felt too personal, too intimate, too closely tied to his daughter's dignity, he absorbed the cost himself. He reserved the program funds for what could be defended in a spreadsheet. This was not martyrdom, it was strategy. He understood that once an external system began to define what was appropriate, it was dangerous to surrender too much of one's inner life to its judgment. Some decisions needed to remain private, even if privacy came at a cost. Still, the strain accumulated. One evening, after a particularly long day, he stood in the kitchen holding a utility notice that had arrived despite his partial payment. The language was firm, but not hostile. A reminder, a timeline, consequences outlined with bureaucratic calm. He opened the portal and stared at the remaining balance. He could pay it off entirely. Doing so would remove one more threat, one more letter, one more interruption. It would feel good, decisive, clean. It would also look aggressive. Aggression, he suspected, would raise questions. Why prioritize this now? Why not distribute funds more evenly? What was the urgency? He paid just enough to push the date back. Afterward, he felt no relief, only a dull acceptance. This was the rhythm now: advance, pause, justify, repeat. His daughter noticed the changes before he did. "You're quieter," she said one night as he tucked her in. "Am I?" he asked. She nodded. "You think a lot." He smiled faintly. "I always think a lot." She considered this, then reached out and took his hand. Her grip was light but deliberate. "I like when you think," she said. "It means you're figuring things out." The simplicity of her trust settled something in him. Later, alone in the living room, he allowed himself a moment of exhaustion. He leaned back against the couch and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to stop performing. For a few minutes, there was no system, no oversight, no narrative to manage. Just a man sitting in the quiet, aware of the weight he carried and the narrow path he walked each day. When he opened his eyes, his phone was vibrating. A new message from the program. He read it slowly, heart steady, breath controlled. "We have questions regarding recent spending patterns. Please be prepared to discuss certain transactions." No details, no timeline, just an invitation. He set the phone down and looked toward his daughter's room. The door closed, light off. Whatever came next, he would handle it the same way he handled everything else. Not with defiance, not with apology, but with explanation. Because the truth, he knew, was simple. Every decision he had made was about keeping a life intact. Whether the system could see that or not was no longer the point. The call did not come immediately. That was the first thing he noticed. After the message arrived, polite, neutral, and unmistakably serious, there was a stretch of silence that lasted 2 days. long enough to be intentional, long enough to let uncertainty do its work. He recognized the tactic, even if he could not prove it. Institutions rarely rushed when they believed time itself could extract compliance. He continued his routine as usual. He woke early, prepared breakfast, reviewed the day's obligations. He walked his daughter to the corner where the crossing guard stood, waited until she was safely inside the school, and then drove to work. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, every action felt provisional. On the third day, the call came while he was standing in line at the hardware store, holding a small pack of screws he did not remember deciding to buy. The phone vibrated once, then again. An unfamiliar number. He stepped outside before answering. "Good afternoon," the voice said. Calm, professional. "This is Aaron Mills from the program review team. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" He glanced at the sky, at the steady gray that suggested rain later. "I do." There was a pause, not long but deliberate, before the man continued. "We've been reviewing your account activity. Overall, things look stable. However, there are a few items we'd like clarification on." Clarification, not accusation, not concern. The language of procedural doubt. "I'm happy to explain," he said. They began with the obvious, the partial payments, the pacing, the absence of large, decisive actions. The reviewer's tone remained neutral, but the questions formed a pattern. Why this amount and not more? And why prioritize this bill over another? Why delay when resources were available? He answered carefully, not defensively. He spoke about thresholds, about timing, about preventing escalation rather than resolving everything at once. He avoided emotional language, resisted the urge to contextualize too deeply. Experience had taught him that too much explanation could sound like justification. The man listened without interrupting, occasionally offering short acknowledgments. Then came the question he had anticipated and hoped would not arrive. There was a grocery purchase that included non-essential items, the reviewer said, referring to a transaction from the previous week. "Nothing significant in cost, but we're trying to understand your decision-making framework." Non-essential. The word landed with more weight than it should have. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Food is not non-essential," he said evenly. "Of course," the man replied quickly. "We're referring to certain items beyond basic staples." He pictured the receipt instantly. The fruit he had chosen because his daughter tolerated it better when she felt unwell. The bread she preferred because it upset her stomach less. None of it appeared extraordinary. All of it could be misunderstood. "My daughter has medical needs that affect her diet," he said. "Consistency matters." There was another pause, longer this time. "I see," the man said. "We don't have that information on file." "I didn't realize it needed to be," he replied. It was not a challenge, it was a statement of fact. They moved on. The conversation continued for nearly 30 minutes, touching on categories, expectations, future considerations. At no point did the reviewer raise his voice or accuse him of wrongdoing. At no point did he reassure him either. When the call ended, the man thanked him for his cooperation and reminded him that the program was designed to encourage responsible use of resources. Responsible, he thought, pocketing his phone. Inside the hardware store, the line had shortened. He paid for the screws and left, though he still did not remember why he had come in the first place. That evening, he replayed the conversation while washing dishes, not with anger, but with analysis. He noted where his answers had felt strong, where they had felt thin. He adjusted his internal model of what the system valued: predictability, moderation, neutral narratives. What it did not value was context. The next morning, he logged into the portal and noticed a subtle change. A new notification banner appeared at the top of the screen. Enhanced review status active. No explanation, no warning. The rules had not changed, but the scrutiny had intensified. This was the moment he had feared, not because he had done anything wrong, but because The system had decided to look closer. Closer inspection rarely favored people like him. The more detail exposed, the more opportunities for misinterpretation. He responded by narrowing his choices even further. He delayed purchases he had planned to make. He reduced payment amounts again. He avoided anything that could be framed as subjective. The apartment grew quieter, tighter, as if shrinking under the pressure. His daughter noticed first. "Are we okay?" she asked one night, sitting cross-legged on her bed. "Yes," he said, sitting beside her. "We're okay." She studied his face, her expression thoughtful. "You say that differently now." He did not know how to respond to that, so he brushed her hair back gently and kissed her forehead. She accepted the gesture and leaned against him. The conversation closed, but not resolved. The program sent a follow-up email 3 days later. This one was longer. It referenced policy sections and compliance metrics. It requested documentation for certain expenses, including explanations for timing and prioritization. He printed the email and laid it out on the table. This was no longer passive observation. This was evaluation. He gathered what they asked for methodically: bills, statements, dates. He attached notes that explained his reasoning in plain language, not emotional, not defensive, just factual. Still, something unsettled him. The system was not questioning whether the expenses were legitimate. It was questioning his judgment, whether he understood how to use resources correctly, whether his choices aligned with their model of responsibility. That model had never included him. When the response came, it arrived not as an email, but as a scheduled video call. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, the background neutral, the lighting adequate. He wore a clean shirt, though no one had asked him to. Old habits surfaced easily under pressure. Two faces appeared on the screen: the man he had spoken to before and a woman he did not recognize. She introduced herself as part of the oversight team. They thanked him for his documentation and began reviewing it line by line. The questions grew sharper. Why had he not paid off the hospital balance entirely when he could have? Why had he chosen to delay certain utilities rather than eliminate them as a risk? Why had he avoided larger payments that would have simplified his situation? He answered each question with care, grounding his responses in experience rather than theory. "I'm not trying to simplify," he said at one point. "I'm trying to stabilize." There was a brief exchange of glances between the two reviewers. "Can you elaborate?" the woman asked. He took a breath. He had been preparing for this moment, though he had not known when it would come. "Paying everything at once doesn't remove risk," he said. "It shifts it. Emergencies don't announce themselves. If I exhaust all available resources to make my account look clean, I leave no room for what comes next." The man nodded slightly, but said nothing. "And," he continued, "I've learned that systems respond differently to urgency than people do. Clearing a balance feels responsible, but it also attracts attention. Spacing payments keeps things predictable." The woman frowned faintly. "That sounds like you're trying to avoid scrutiny." "I'm trying to survive it," he replied. The words hung between them, heavier than he had intended. There was silence, the kind that indicated recalibration. "We appreciate your perspective," the woman said finally. "However, the program is designed to encourage decisive resolution of financial stressors." "With respect," he said, his voice steady, "decisive resolution isn't always possible. Sometimes it's just delayed collapse." He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He stated what he knew to be true. The conversation ended shortly after that, with promises to review internally and follow up with next steps. When the screen went dark, he sat very still, hands folded, waiting for the familiar surge of anxiety. It did not come. Instead, there was something else. A quiet, unexpected clarity. He had said what needed to be said. If the system withdrew access, he would adapt. He always had. What mattered was that for the first time, He had not reshaped his reasoning to fit their expectations. He had not performed responsibility. He had defined it. That night, he slept more deeply than he had in weeks. The outcome arrived 2 days later. Access would continue. However, his account would remain under enhanced review. He would be expected to provide periodic explanations. Flexibility would be limited. He read the message twice, then closed his laptop. Nothing had changed, and everything had. The system had not fully accepted his logic, but it had acknowledged it. That was enough. Not victory, not validation, but space. He looked around the apartment, the same walls, the same quiet, the same fragile equilibrium, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not relief, authority. The change did not announce itself. There was no letter, no meeting, no moment he could point to and say, this is when it shifted. Instead, it arrived gradually, like a sound you only notice once the room goes quiet enough to hear it. After the review period settled into its new rhythm, the system's presence became less intrusive. Not kinder, never that, but more predictable. The requests for documentation spaced themselves out. The questions softened, losing their edge of suspicion. He learned the intervals, the language, the cadence of oversight. He adjusted, not by surrendering more of himself, but by reclaiming the parts he had almost given away. Predictability, he discovered, could be shaped from both sides. One afternoon, an email arrived asking if he would be willing to provide feedback on the program's structure. The wording was cautious, framed as optional, exploratory. He read it twice, then closed his laptop without responding. Feedback was another kind of exposure, another place where words could be misunderstood. But the email stayed with him. That evening, his daughter sat at the table working on her homework, her pencil gripped carefully between her fingers. She paused often, resting her hand, managing her energy the way she always did. He watched her from the sink, drying dishes he had already cleaned once just to stay busy. "Dad," she said suddenly, "do you think people know how hard things are?" He turned, surprised. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "At school, everyone thinks stuff just works. Like lights and food and doctors, they don't think about it." He considered this. "Most people don't have to." She nodded, accepting this explanation easily. Then she added, "But you do." "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." That night, after she fell asleep, he opened the laptop again and reread the email. The invitation was still there, waiting. He thought about the review call, about the moment he had said, "I'm trying to survive it." He remembered the silence that followed, the recalibration he had sensed on the other end of the line. For years, survival had required invisibility. He had learned to keep his head down, to comply without comment, to explain only when asked. That strategy had kept his life intact, but it had also erased him from the conversation. He typed a response. He did not write emotionally. He did not accuse. He described processes, trade-offs, real-world consequences. He explained why partial payments prevented cascading failures, why flexibility mattered more than resolution, why responsibility could not be measured without context. He did not ask for changes. He described realities. When he finished, he reread the message, then sent it before he could reconsider. The response came a week later, not a thank you, but an acknowledgement. His feedback had been forwarded to a review committee. They appreciated his perspective. They might follow up. He closed the email and felt nothing dramatic, no relief, no pride, just a sense of having placed something where it belonged. Life continued. Bills arrived. Appointments filled the calendar. Work demanded his attention. The system remained present but no longer dominated his thoughts. It had become one factor among many, not the axis around which everything turned. And then, unexpectedly, the follow-up came. This time, the invitation was explicit. A meeting, not to review his account, but to discuss program design. He stared at the screen for a long time before responding. In the end, he agreed. The meeting took place over video. 5 faces appeared on the screen, arranged neatly in their respective frames. Titles were exchanged, introductions made. He recognized none of them, and none recognized him beyond a name and a case number. They asked him to describe his experience. He did. He spoke about survival as a skill set, about the way scarcity trained attention and discipline. He explained how oversight, when divorced from lived reality, often punished the very behavior it claimed to encourage. He described the cost of constant justification, the exhaustion of performing responsibility rather than practicing it. They listened. Not all of them understood. He could see that in their expressions, in the slight tightening around their eyes when he spoke about ambiguity as a tool of control. But some of them leaned forward. Some took notes. At one point, someone asked, "What would you change?" He paused. "I wouldn't change the resources," he said. "I'd change the assumptions." They waited. "Stop assuming misuse is the default," he continued. "Stop treating caution as avoidance, and stop designing systems that require people to prove their worthiness over and over again. Most of us are already doing that every day." The room went quiet. After the meeting ended, he sat alone in the kitchen, laptop closed, hands resting on the table. He did not know whether anything would come of it. He did not need it to. Speaking had been enough. Weeks passed. One morning, a message arrived that was different from the others. No warnings, no reminders, just information. The program was introducing a new role, participant advisor, someone who would consult on policy decisions, review guidelines for unintended consequences, provide perspective from lived experience. The position was paid, modestly but fairly. The hours were flexible. They asked if he would consider it. He read the message twice, then a third time. The irony was not lost on him. For years, his voice had been a liability. Now it was being requested. He did not accept immediately. He talked to his daughter about it over dinner, explaining in simple terms what it would mean. She listened carefully, as she always did. "So you'd help them understand?" she asked. "Yes." "Like how things really are?" "Yes." She smiled, small and certain. "That's good. You're good at that." He accepted the role the next day. Nothing else changed overnight. His apartment did not grow larger. His life did not become easier in any obvious way. The bills did not disappear. His daughter still required careful monitoring, still moved through the world with deliberate caution. But something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer just navigating the system. He was shaping it, however slightly. The meetings were not glamorous. Policy discussions rarely were. He learned the language of frameworks and metrics, the careful balancing of interests that often diluted intention. He spoke when it mattered and stayed silent when it didn't. He learned when to push and when to wait. And slowly, subtly, the language began to change. Guidelines became clearer. Ambiguity narrowed. Flexibility was acknowledged as a feature rather than a flaw. It was not revolution, it was adjustment. But adjustment mattered. At home, his daughter noticed the difference before he did. "You don't look as tired," she said one evening. He laughed softly. "I'm still tired." "I know," she said, "but not the same." He thought about that later, lying awake in the dark. The exhaustion had not vanished, but it had changed texture. It was no longer sharpened by constant defense. It was the tiredness of effort, not fear. One afternoon, as they walked past the grocery store, his daughter stopped at the window display. Among the usual clutter of promotions sat a small stack of notebooks, their covers bright and clean. "Can I?" she asked, not pointing, not reaching, just asking. He looked at the price. It was reasonable, defensible. But more than that, it was human. "Yes," he said. At the register, he paid without hesitation, without calculation beyond the practical. No one would question it. No one would review the receipt. But even if they did, He knew now how he would explain it. That night, as she wrote her name carefully on the first page, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. Not triumph, not relief, alignment. Survival had once required silence. It had demanded invisibility, compliance, endurance without commentary. But over time, survival had done something else. It had taught him where the system failed. It had given him clarity, discipline, and a perspective no framework could simulate. And eventually, that perspective had become a voice. Not a loud one, not a celebrated one, but a steady one, grounded in the simple truth he had lived every day. Money was never the point, neither was permission. What mattered was the right to decide, to explain, to exist without constant defense. He looked around the apartment, the same walls, the same quiet, the same fragile equilibrium, and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Not hope, confidence, because whatever came next, he knew this now with certainty. He was no longer just surviving, he was participating. Nothing about his life had become easy. That was the truth. He no longer felt the need to soften. The bills still arrived on schedule. The calendar remained crowded with appointments and reminders. His daughter's health still demanded vigilance, restraint, and choices most people never had to consider. Stability, when it came, was conditional and required maintenance. But it was no longer fragile in the same way. It no longer depended on silence. He had learned something the system could not teach itself, that responsibility did not look like resolution, and dignity did not come from compliance. It came from being trusted to decide, to explain, and to be heard without performing gratitude or fear. For years, survival had trained him to disappear at the edges of institutions, to move quietly so no one would question his presence. Now he understood that disappearing had never been the same as being safe. What changed was not his financial position in any dramatic sense. It was his relationship to power. He no longer experienced it only as pressure applied from above, but as something that could be shaped, questioned, and redirected. Slowly, imperfectly, but meaningfully. At home, the change was subtle. Fewer pauses before simple decisions. Fewer calculations layered over moments that should never have required them. His daughter noticed it in the way he spoke, in the way he listened, in the way he no longer carried every choice like a defense. The system would continue to exist. It would still fail people. It would still reduce lives to categories and metrics. But somewhere within it, there was now a trace of lived truth, placed there not by charity, not by reform, but by endurance. He had not been rescued. He had not been redeemed. He had done something far more difficult. He had remained intact long enough to speak and been changed not by having more, but by finally being counted.